The day a moving truck blocked my driveway, I wasn't expecting the man who vanished from my phone to climb out, squint into the afternoon sun, and smile like we were old neighbors. He ghosted me, no explanation, no goodbye, and then fate parked his life beside mine with a squeaky dolly and a box labeled kitchen. My stomach flipped. My heart bargained, and on our shared hallway's scuffed tiles I wondered, how do you forgive a door that slammed so hard? If this story touches you, please like, subscribe, and share. Your support helps more hearts find comfort and hope today. Hey friends, come in, get comfortable. If you're holding a cup of tea, take a sip. I want to tell you a story that surprised me into relearning what grace looks like, and how a heart can choose to stay open even when it's been hurt. I'll start with a detail that still makes me smile. The scuffed blue wall outside my apartment door. It's a little thing, a scrape at hip height where groceries have brushed by for years, where the paint has flaked in the shape of a crescent moon. Every morning I pass it on the way to work. Every evening I unlock my door and think about repainting it. And for a long time, that quiet crescent was just a reminder that things wear down with time and care and still, somehow, hold. My name is Sam. I live on the second floor of a modest brick building on a tree-lined street where the garbage trucks sing before sunrise and the dog walkers know each other's names. I'm in my late 30s and I have one of those jobs that makes you learn patience in inches. I coordinate volunteers for a community food pantry. We keep the heartbeat going for folks who need a bag of groceries and a smile that doesn't ask too many questions. My days are humble and sturdy, and most nights end with my grandmother's quilt over my knees and a book I don't finish because sleep has stronger opinions than I do. That's the setting. That's the life I was living when I met Leo. We had matched on a dating app on a Tuesday. Nothing flashy. A photograph by a lake where he was holding a sweater in one hand, his hair refusing to stay in place, and this little crinkle near his left eye like laughter had left a fingerprint there. His message was thoughtful. Not a heart eye emoji or a hey. He'd said, "I noticed the book in your second photo, A Tree Grows in Brooklyn." That was my mom's favorite, and I thought, okay, there's a door opening. Here, we talked about library cards and our favorite diner breakfasts and the small secret joys that make a day feel like something more than errands, like the last spoonful of peanut butter or the way a thunderstorm smells if you open the window just enough. He sent a recording of his laugh by accident, a voice memo you couldn't replicate if you tried, where he said, "No, not that song." And his laughter tripped over itself like a kid down a hill. Maybe it sounds silly, but human beings are made of these things. A laugh is a promise. Or at least it felt like one. We met at a coffee shop near the park on a Saturday. It was warm enough to sit outside. He wore a gray hoodie and the air smelled like cinnamon, and the barista sang along to a 70s playlist. Our conversation didn't so much begin as continue. He told me he was an elementary school music teacher who kept a blue kazoo in his desk for emergencies. I told him I once taught a cooking class without power during a storm by turning it into a lesson on cold soups and resilience. We walked until the sun imagined it could set, and then, when we reached the corner where we had to part, he hesitated like people do when their heart and their fear are negotiating. "Can I see you again?" he asked, and I nodded too fast because I was trying not to give Hope a microphone. We saw each other again. We sat on a bench near the dog park and made up backstories for the dogs and their people. We ordered pancakes the size of hubcaps and brought home leftovers for lunches we both forgot we had. We didn't talk about our pasts in bullet points. We built a space between us where silence didn't need an apology, where eye contact felt like a soft place to rest for 2 hours, 3. Imagine that feeling. Let it land. And then suddenly there wasn't a message. It was like someone had taken the conversation I was carrying in my pocket and stolen it while I wasn't looking. 2 hours became 10, which became a day, and I gave him the benefit of the doubt because life is complicated. Another day passed. I reached out again. "Hope you're okay." Nothing. I sent one more message. "If you want to talk, I'm here." No reply. A week later, I stopped refreshing. I did that thing you do when you want to be dignified and kind to yourself. I put his name in a mental drawer. Not to punish him. Not to punish me. But because I was raised by people who believed in not chasing folks who won't walk with you, I'm not dramatic about ghosting. It hurts. It hurts because it's empty where an explanation should go, because your brain tries to solve a puzzle that wasn't made to be solved from your side. But I told myself what my Aunt Ruth used to say, "Put hope in the pantry, dear. You can always take it down later and it won't spoil." So I did. I kept going. I went to work. I delivered fresh apples to a grandmother who told me a story about her first dance, and for a second I thought maybe the universe pays attention after all. I listened to the oldies station and hummed along during traffic. I cooked my mother's lentil soup recipe and invited my neighbor, Mrs. Green, over to share it. Life moved, as it does, one grocery bag at a time. Weeks later, on a Monday bright enough to make us suspicious, the moving truck arrived. I was coming home early. A volunteer shift had been canceled, and I decided to treat myself to the kind of slow afternoon you earmark for quiet. Laundry, plant watering, maybe a nap. But there it was, a white truck in the street, hazards blinking like it was thinking, and a young guy with strong arms, and a neon shirt lifting a box marked Books. I parked mine in the lot behind the building and looped around to the front just as someone wrestled a small potted fern. Out of the back, one of those ferns that can't decide if it's thriving or barely hanging on. And then he climbed down. Gray t-shirt, jeans, eyes the color of a bruise healing, hair messed up by the cap he'd been wearing. He shielded his face from the sun with one hand, and I could see he was trying to place the building, or the moment, or me. Then he recognized me, and the expression on his face did something unusual, like a wave that didn't know whether to crash or bow. "Sam?" he said, like he didn't have a right to ask my name. He looked thinner. That was my first unfair thought, that absences had edged his cheeks. I could have pretended I didn't hear. I could have nodded and kept going. But his name sat in my mouth like a sweet I hadn't allowed myself in a while. "Hi, Leo." He glanced toward the door, then at the number stenciled above it, and then at me, and he laughed, not because it was funny, but because sometimes astonishment uses laughter to catch its breath. This is—" He swallowed and tried again. I didn't know. Didn't know what? The words came out softer than I felt. There was no storm in my voice. "I didn't want to embarrass either of us in front of the moving guys. That you lived here," he said helplessly, like the universe had just pulled a prank with our addresses. "I'm next door." Behind him, a dolly squeaked its impatience, a practical sound that meant the world would continue no matter how long our hearts stared at each other. I looked at the fern. It looked back as judgmental as ferns get. I took a breath I had been storing for weeks. "Well," I said, and I pushed the door open. "Welcome to the building. Humility is an odd jacket. It never looks how you think it will." I climbed the stairs, and he followed a few beats later, carrying 2 boxes like they hadn't yet learned how heavy they were. At the second-floor landing, I paused at the little blue crescent in the paint out of habit. He saw it and smiled a little. "Still there," he said, as if he'd known it long enough to have a memory of it, too. That hurt in a tender way, the way a bruise does when you press it to make sure it's healing. We stood in the hall. 2 people with 100 unsaid things stacked between them like luggage we didn't want to unpack with the neighbors watching. Score 1 for boundaries or cowardice. Take your pick and be kind about it. I put my key in my lock, looked at him for a heartbeat too long, and said, "If you need anything, tools, tape, a glass of water, knock." He nodded. "Thank you," he said. And then his mouth shaped like he was about to say something else, something more. But the moving guy hollered, "Which one's 2B?" And the moment put its jacket back on. I closed my door. I leaned my back against it. I put my palms on my knees to steady myself. I listened to footsteps and low voices and the scrape of furniture against the hallway floor. The wall between our apartments is old and fond of telling secrets. That afternoon, it offered me the occasional thud, the humid sound of cardboard sighing as it gave up its contents, and a burst of music like the tale of a song. It might have been a mistake in the universe. It might have been a gift. Either way, I made tea. That first week, I learned the small things you learn about a person when you share a wall and walk. He leaves before 8, keys jingling like coins in a pocket. He takes the stairs 2 at a time. He laughs on the phone sometimes with a sound I recognized and sometimes doesn't answer at all. He hums when he's packing his lunch. He returns with groceries on Wednesdays, always with bananas. And one night I heard him shift furniture around until midnight. It sounded like a sofa trying to understand a room that wasn't designed for it. On Thursday, there was a soft knock on my door. I opened to find him with a serious expression and a small offering, a jar of honey. "My friend keeps bees," he said, as if it explained both the honey and the nervousness. "It's the good kind. Thought you might like it. I took it. Is this a neighborly gift or a peace offering?" I asked, because sometimes you can choose the terms of your conversations, and sometimes you can't, and this felt like one of those rare times when you can. He looked down at his shoes. "Both," I moved aside. "Come in," I said. The word surprised me, but kindness has always been the language I speak when I don't know what else to do. We sat at my small kitchen table with 2 chairs. He looked around like people do when they're learning you in a new way. He noticed the quilt on the back of the couch and the small jar of ribbon my grandmother used to collect, each one for a story about a gift she once gave. He touched the lid of the honey with a forefinger so gently it made me want to wrap the whole day in newspaper. "I'm sorry," he said. It was a sentence with weight. It sat there like a packed suitcase. "For what?" I asked, because apologizing is both a start and a map, and I needed to know where we were going. "Disappearing," he said, and he looked at me with eyes that didn't flinch from what they had done. "I'm not going to make excuses. I left you on red. I left you wondering." He swallowed. "And then this apartment. My friend in the district had a colleague moving to Oregon, and it was all fast, and the rent was—" I said yes. I said yes, because it was an answer that solved a lot of questions at once. "I didn't know you lived here. Not until I saw your car." He shook his head. A soft shake like disbelief had turned into shame. I thought about turning around. "But you didn't," I said. He smiled without humor. The deposit was non-refundable. The oven clicked as it cooled from nothing. Outside, a bus sighed at the stop down the block like an old man sitting down. I wrapped my fingers around my mug to borrow its warmth. "I'm not going to tell you your reasons," I said. "If you want to explain, you can. If you don't, we can leave it here. I'm okay with being neighbors. We can help each other with packages and smell each other's dinners under the door and exchange holiday cards like normal people. We can do that." He stared at his hands for a while. When he lifted his eyes, they were damp but not dramatic. "My mom had a stroke," he said, plain as rain. "The night after our second date. I was at her apartment when your message came in. Hope you're okay." It felt like a kindness I didn't know what to do with. "I slept on her couch for 3 weeks. We were in and out of the hospital and then the rehab center and then home. And I kept thinking I'd send you a message that said everything all at once. But there was no all at once. There was only one more appointment and don't cry in the pharmacy aisle." I put the phone in a drawer the second week. That's the truth. That's how grief tells its story. Not in chapters, but in receipts and hospital wristbands and cold cups of coffee you're too tired to be mad at. My chest softened. I didn't let myself get ahead of it. He kept going. "I didn't know how to reach out without making you responsible for something you had no part in. That was my mistake," he said, eyes holding mine, so I knew he meant the choice, not the circumstance. "I thought it would be kinder to disappear. I told myself I'd apologize when the dust settled. But the dust didn't settle. It just learned to live in my house. And then months passed, and I told myself it was too late, that I'd be barging in with old news and you'd be better off. And then I took this apartment and here we are. There it was. There were holes and rough edges, as there are when a person tries to explain a wound, but there was also an accountable sorrow. He didn't hand me a bouquet of excuses. He handed me the thorns and let me decide whether I wanted to touch them. "I'm sorry for your mom," I said. The sentence felt small next to what he'd carried, but small kindnesses are how we walk across long bridges. "How is she now?" "Better," he said. "She's still recovering. She has a home care aide 3 days a week. She's stubborn in a way that makes me grateful and exhausted. Yesterday, we sat on her balcony and sang 'You Are My Sunshine,' and it was off-key and perfect. She forgets the word for microwave, but she remembers the name of her first cat." "Maybe that's the one we're supposed to save," I said. "The first names of things we loved," he smiled. It reached the crinkle by his left eye. "Sam, I'm—" I am really sorry for the way I handled everything. I believe you, I said. I did. Belief is not the same as erasing. It's not the same as inviting whatever it was back in as if nothing happened. It's one step, placed carefully. And I accept your apology, I added, and watched his shoulders soften like a tightly folded shirt finally let out. And I think I need some time to decide what to do with it. That's fair, he said quickly, gratefully. I don't expect anything. I just didn't want to begin this neighbor thing on a lie of silence. He stood, tentatively, and then sat down again because something in me must have said with my body, stay. I didn't push it. We ate toast with honey. We talked about the building, the heat that runs too hot in the evenings, the mailbox that sticks unless you sweet-talk it, the way the hallway light flickers like an old movie once a week for no good reason, then stops. There are some conversations that are just two people filling silence. This wasn't that. This was two people building a small bridge out of plain words and sugar. When he left, he paused at my door and looked at the blue crescent in the paint. You never repainted, he said. I like to remember, I told him. It keeps me tender. The days after were an exercise in being simple. If the universe brings you a situation with a neon sign that says, complicated, sometimes the best gift you can give it is to breathe slow. We were neighborly. We walked down the stairs at the same time and held the door for each other. He asked how the pantry was doing, and I told him about the new freezer we'd managed to arrange. He told me about his students, one who had learned to hold a violin bow like it had always been there, and another who kept losing his recorder under his bed. We didn't talk about the earlier versions of ourselves, except when the conversation made room for them with a kind of grace you don't push. The first time I saw him across the hall in a full-body way, dressed for the world, it was the next Saturday. He stood by his door, bag over his shoulder, unwrapping a granola bar with his teeth because his hands were busy. He smiled, and I tried not to catalog it. I'm off to see my mom, he said. Give her my best, I said. I will, he said, then hesitated. She asked me yesterday if I was dating anyone. I told her my heart was learning to synchronize again. He shrugged, embarrassed by his own honesty. She said she understood. I like her already, I said. He laughed and went down the stairs, and I stood there for a minute, watching the dust specks swim in the patch of sunlight like snow in a slow snow globe. For every bit of tenderness, there were also awkward moments. Vulnerability doesn't polish the floor. It just makes a person less afraid to walk across it. I had days when I resented the coincidence, when the sound of his laughter through the wall made me want to turn up the radio out of spite and not out of melody. There's a clarity in admitting that. Hope is beautiful, but it's not tidy. On the second Sunday in his new home, the building had its potluck in the small back courtyard. Our building is the kind where people bring folding chairs and ask where you bought your ketchup. Mrs. Green brought her famous potato salad, which is famous because it's the same every year, simple and made with love and a lot of people's stories in it. Mr. Patel, our landlord, wore a linen shirt and told a long joke about a plumbing emergency that had 3 endings. We hung paper lanterns swinging from string. Children ran with a kind of joy that makes you check your pockets to see if you still carry something like it yourself. Leo arrived with a Tupperware full of deviled eggs he'd made at 9 in the morning because it's the dish his mother always trusts him with. He stood beside me and we chatted with the neighbors like we were in a photograph labeled, Folks Who Live Here. When Mr. Patel's speaker coughed an old Sam Cooke song into the air, I don't know who moved first, but suddenly we were just 2 people shifting our weight to a beat we both knew. Not a dance, but a way of saying our bodies remembered things our hearts were still cautious to try again. It was nice. That word matters more than people think. Nice can be the difference between a day that bruises and a day that heals. As summer tucked itself into fall, we settled into a rhythm that felt something like friendship with a question mark at the end of it. He taught me how to make a decent omelet. I lent him a hammer. He returned it with a note that said, Thank you for trusting me with small, important things. We took our trash out at the same time, which felt both ordinary and intimate. He dropped off homemade soup when I had a cold. I texted him a photo of a sunset over the block when I knew he was stuck grading papers and needed a reminder that outside existed. One night, the power went out during a storm. The building sighed, and the darkness landed like a blanket you didn't ask for. Rain turned from polite to serious, and a siren in the distance sounded like an old memory trying to find its name. I lit candles. I thought about the way light looks when it tries to be helpful without showing off. My phone buzzed against the tabletop. "You good?" it read. It was him. "Yes," I wrote back. "Candles and tea. You?" "Flashlight concert," he replied. He sent a photo of his guitar propped on his knee, a small beam of light shining off the strings like they were trying to remember their spark. I smiled, even though no one could see it. A soft knock followed a few minutes later. I opened the door to find him holding a plate of warm cornbread wrapped in a clean dish towel. "Was baking when the power went," he said. "It's decent, even half done." We sat on my couch in the flicker of candlelight, listening to rain write long sentences against the world. The cornbread was sweeter than I expected. We spoke in low voices the way people do when the power is out, as if sound itself could get lost in the dark and we needed to be kind to it. This is when he told me about therapy, about starting last spring and going twice a month since. Not for the first time. He said quietly, "I did it before, after college, but I didn't know back then how to be honest. Now I try to be plainly human. My therapist is gracious and asks good questions like they're opening windows." I nodded. I told him I was one of those people who had always thought I had to be the strong one. Oldest child who made sure the bags were packed, the door locked, the soup hot. I admitted I was learning what it looked like to let someone see me in pieces and not clean them up first. "It's hard," I said. "But I'm tired of being my own only witness." He didn't answer right away. He put his empty plate on the table and folded the dish towel, smoothing the edges like Grace had hands. "Sam," he said, "can I read you something?" He stood like he was going to go get it, but then realized it was in his pocket already, folded into a square so precise I could almost hear his careful breathing from earlier. He held it out like he was offering a leaf he'd been keeping safe. "It's something I wrote. I wasn't sure if I should give it to you, but since the lights are out and we're all in our plain selves right now, I thought maybe the truth could sit here with us." I took the paper. It was a letter. He had written it in pen, not on a screen, which matters because ink forgives less. It said, among other things, that he had been wrong. That fear isn't kindness dressed as protection. It's fear. It said he wanted to own the hurt he'd caused without telling me what to do with it. It said he hoped to be the sort of person who didn't need to hide from love, because love doesn't require perfection, only showing up. It wasn't eloquent in a flowery way. It was plain in a way that made me feel like he'd sat on his floor and taken long breaths between sentences so he wouldn't lie. When I looked up, he was looking at his hands. I touched the letter. It was soft in one corner where he'd held it too long. "Thank you," I said, and the words landed like a handshake neither of us wanted to let go too soon. We didn't kiss then. There are films that would make us, scenes that would push us together because the candles were doing their best and the rain was a chorus. But I am grateful to this day that we didn't. We just sat together in the quiet, two people who had been strangers, then almost, then lost, then found next door. I leaned my head back on the couch and listened to how his breath held steady even when the lightning flashed. Sometimes the most intimate act is choosing not to hurry. After the storm, after the lights learned their way back, after the hum of the fridge filled the room again with an everyday promise, we went to sleep in separate apartments. I stood in my kitchen and refolded the dish towel because it felt like rearranging the day into something that made sense. I put his letter back in its envelope and slid it into the drawer with the rubber bands and notepads and the lone key that belongs to something I no longer own. I looked at the drawer for a long time. I don't know if anyone tells you this, but healing looks ordinary. It looks like drawer organization and wiping candle wax off a saucer and brushing your teeth for the night. We began to practice a version of dating that could only have existed because of the particular ridiculousness of our situation. We were neighbors, so we walked together in the evenings and talked about nothing in a way that meant everything. We agreed to structure. We decided to talk on purpose. We named every fear so the monsters under the bed had labels. On Wednesdays, we had dinner in one of our kitchens and no dessert, so we would take a walk and make room for words. On Fridays, we watched movies but kept the lights a little brighter than a romance would ask, because we wanted to see each other clearly. On Sundays, we didn't pretend anything. If I was tired, I said so. If he was sad, he didn't try to leave it at his mother's door. There were moments when trust arrived in shy ways. He called when he said he would. I felt my shoulders lower when his phone buzzed and he didn't look, because we'd both decided we wanted to be present in real time more than we wanted to be reachable in every moment everywhere. He brought me a new paintbrush one afternoon with a note that said, "For the blue crescent, if you ever decide to repaint." I laughed and tucked it behind the oven clock because I wasn't ready, and he didn't ask me to be. Mrs. Green became the keeper of our neighborhood's wisdom. She had the kind of eyes that make you want to confess your small meannesses and your big hopes. She'd meet me at the mailboxes and ask after my heart with the same seriousness she asked after my car. She liked Leo because he remembered to bring his dish back when she sent him home with leftovers, because he talked to her like she was a full person and not someone you talk over. "That boy," she said one afternoon, nodding toward his door, "has a good heart that's seen some weather. You'll know what to do with that if you decide to." We had our first official date 3 months after he moved in. It was a choice. We wanted the word date because it's a ceremony, a way to say, this matters enough to name. We returned to the diner where we'd once shared pancakes and the hope of a second plate. The waitress recognized me. She set 2 mugs on the table before we asked. "Good to see you too," she said. We didn't correct her. We didn't explain anything to strangers who already understood more than the basic shape of this story. He held the menu and didn't read it. He looked at me across the table the way you look at someone you're still building a map of. I said, "Ask me anything." He surprised me by not using the moment for a heavy question. He asked about the best advice my father ever gave me. "Never leave a room without making it better in some small way," I said. "Straighten a chair, pick up a piece of paper. It doesn't have to be big. It teaches you to leave people better, too." He nodded and told me his first music teacher once wrote on his report, "Leo hears the space between notes with care." I told him I liked the way that sounded more than any talent show ribbon. When the check came, he reached for it. I let him. Then I left a generous tip and a note for our waitress that said, "Your kindness is the kind that keeps a week going." On the walk home, he kept his hands tucked in his coat pockets, not because he was nervous or held back, but because it was cold and also because sometimes keeping your own hands warm teaches you how to reach for someone without expecting them to be your gloves. We stopped at the corner by the little park, and he said very gently, "Can I hold your hand?" he asked. He didn't assume. Praise the small requests that rebuild a world. I said yes. His hand was warm and a little rough from fixing a shelf that afternoon, and it fit mine without making any promises it couldn't keep yet. We walked. It felt like the simplest answer to a complicated equation. Winter tucked in. His mother had a cough that scared him and then didn't. We baked bread on a Sunday, and it didn't rise the way the recipe had promised. And we sat on the floor eating warm, dense slices anyway, laughing because imperfection is often delicious. He came to the pantry one Saturday and stocked shelves alongside me, and an older man with gentle eyes looked at him and then at me and said, "You two take good care." Later, I told him I was proud of the way he listens. He squeezed my shoulder in that casual, intimate way that means I see you too. On New Year's Eve, the building was noisy in a friendly way. A kid on the first floor banged pots at midnight. Someone shouted, "Happy!" into the hall as if it were a full sentence. I texted Mrs. Green, who had gone to bed at 10 like a person who knows what she needs, and she replied, "May your year be soft and full of soup." Leo and I stood in our shared hallway beneath that flickering light that chooses its moments like a cat. He looked at me, really looked, and said, "We've come a long way from silence." I swallowed around a warmth that held both easy joy and the ache of the past and nodded. We kissed then, and it was not cinematic. It was tender and true. It was relief and promise and an "I'm here," said not with words but with breath. In the weeks that followed, we learned a different kind of everyday. We gave each other keys, not because we were erasing boundaries, but because we were choosing trust in a way that would matter most when one of us needed the other on an ordinary afternoon. He left me a note before school sometimes, a small square that said, "There's soup on the stove," or "You were brave last night," because I had gone to a meeting I'd been dreading and told the truth even though my voice shook. I texted him mid-morning reminders to drink water and not to grade everything during lunch. He shook his head at me and did it anyway because he's human. We learned the art of the check-in. What does your heart need today? We'd ask. Not what do you want to eat? The answer might be quiet. It might be a walk. Around the block while we hold hands and don't problem solve. It might be tell me a story my mother told me when I was a kid because I can't remember the ends anymore. When he asked for that last one, I told him about a rabbit who loved a storm because it meant the world was making noise louder than his heartbeat. He exhaled in a way that loosened his shoulders. Not every day was fair skied. We argued about small things because small things like where to put the dish soap become symbols for how we were raised and how we learned to solve problems. Once, frustrated, I cleaned my kitchen with the kind of concentration you give to the only thing you can control. He knocked on my door and asked, "Am I allowed to make a mistake and still be forgiven?" And I said honestly, yes. But I need 5 minutes to decide how big this mistake is in the story of us. He nodded and sat in the hall with his back against the blue crescent wall like he'd known it forever. After we made tea and didn't pretend we hadn't been small with each other. That is one definition of love. Spring turned the corners of the streets green. Neighbors started leaving their windows open. We did too, and I could hear his guitar in the evenings like he was tuning our days to something more forgiving. One night I fell asleep on my couch and woke to a gentle knock. He stood with a blanket in his arms, half asleep himself. "Your light was on," he whispered, as if the hallway might be sleeping too. He tucked the blanket around me, kissed my forehead once, and left. Some gestures build a home inside your chest. He asked me to meet his mom on a gentle Sunday afternoon. We brought lilies. She wore a pale house dress and smiled with a mouth that had taught him how to be tender. "Ah," she said when he introduced me. "So this is the man whose voice makes my son's shoulders come down when he says your name." She insisted we eat cookies she'd carefully arranged on a plate like a constellation and told me the story of how Leo once tried to teach their cat to fetch the mail. We laughed at all the right places and the offbeat ones too. When she stood to get water, she wobbled and found me steady. After, on the drive back, he was quiet. At a red light, he said, "I almost lost her." I touched the back of his hand and said, "I know." You don't need to say more when the truth is heavy and simple. We made little rituals that belonged only to us. We marked the first day of summer with breakfast on the stoop. We took turns reading each other to sleep when the day wouldn't let go. I kept the paintbrush he gave me near the wall with the blue crescent, and some nights, as I passed it, I'd think about what it would feel like to finally repaint, to choose new over memory, to stitch the past into the quilt of my present in a way that made it stronger, not erased. On the 1-year anniversary of the moving truck day, I woke early. I made coffee and thought about that moment, the sun in his eyes, the regret in his voice, the way the future had cleared its throat while we stood in the hall. I opened my door to get the paper and found a small box on the mat. Inside, wrapped in tissue, was a tiny ceramic door with a blue crescent on it, painted by hand in a shade that matched the scuff on our wall. A note was tucked beneath it, to the door that slammed and then opened next door. It read in his careful letters, "Thank you for forgiving my knock. Love, Leo." I took the little door in my hand and felt the weight of 100 small acts of kindness that had brought us here. I thought about all the reasons people give for disappearing and all the reasons they return, and how it takes two to witness both and decide which stories will live. I put the ceramic door on the shelf by my key so I'd see it every day in that ordinary moment of leaving and returning. That evening, we stood in the hall, 2 grown men with a paint can and drop cloth, like we were about to redecorate a memory. I held the brush. He held the can. Mrs. Green shuffled past with 2 bags of groceries and stopped to smile at us. "Finally getting to it?" she asked. "Finally," I said, and dipped the brush. We painted the wall together. The blue crescent disappeared under a calm, new shade that matched the rest of the hallway. It didn't feel like erasing. It felt like integrating. It felt like placing the scuff into the category of things you don't need to stare at anymore to know what you learned from them. When we finished, we stood back, hands on our hips like proud uncles. "I'll miss it," he admitted, in a funny way. "Me too," I said, and then, because it was time, I put the paintbrush down, reached for his hand, and led him into our kitchen. A year and change later, we're still next door. People always ask if we've moved in together, and this is the part of the story I love most. We decided to keep both apartments for now. Privacy is not a punishment. It's a practice of trust. There is something tender and wise about being able to say, I love you. And tonight, I'm going to sleep in my space so I can miss you while the moon does what it does. We spend most nights together, yes. We've learned where the floor creaks at 3 a.m. We've learned how to tell time by the sound of the bus and by the way the morning light lands on his kitchen table. But some nights, I go home to my own couch, to my grandmother's quilt, to the soft click of my own stove. I water the basil we forgot to turn toward the sun. I make a cup of tea, write a letter, and feel the weight of a love that doesn't demand I disappear myself to prove I care. Then around 11, I hear a gentle knock through the wall. Not a hand, but a guitar string or two. And I smile into the dark because sometimes the sweetest sound in this world is knowing the person you love is close enough to borrow sugar or bravery without having to put on shoes. If you've been ghosted, if you've known that weird, hollow silence that turns your phone into a little mirror that shows you your own patient face. I want you to hear this. You are not difficult to love. Your dignity isn't a bargaining chip. You don't have to wait at a closed door forever. Sometimes doors close because they should. Sometimes they open again with a knock that deserves your consideration. And sometimes the door you thought you lost will end up right beside you, living its own life, learning its own lessons, and choosing you with both hands. We can't all have the strange luxury of a moving truck pulling our past into our present and asking us how brave we want to be. But we can all learn to make peace with the parts of our story that didn't go the way we planned. We can all learn to say yes slowly, to ask for what we need, to ask permission to hold a hand, to accept honey as a peace offering and know it doesn't necessarily mean the whole world will be sweet. But tonight, this teaspoon is. I keep the tiny ceramic door by my keys still. We touch it when we're heading out into the world's noise and when we return to this quieter hall. It reminds me that forgiveness doesn't erase. It integrates. It reminds me that trust is a bridge built plank by two sets of hands. It reminds me that once, a man I had almost allowed myself to forget learned to knock, and when I opened, he didn't explain away his mistakes. He named them. He said their names. And then we found our way toward gratitude, toward cornbread by candlelight, toward the kind of everyday that makes the whole arc of a life feel like a procession of small, holy moments. I don't know what the blue crescent wall looks like in your story. Maybe it's a relationship that never became a relationship. Maybe it's a goodbye no one planned. Maybe it's the day you learned you needed to talk to yourself the way you talk to someone you love. Whatever it is, I hope you get to paint it one day. Not because it was ugly, not because you want to pretend it never happened, but because you are ready for the next sentence, ready for the next afternoon music, the next trip to the mailbox where the lid sticks unless you sweet-talk it. Sometimes, yes, the person who left returns in a way that's true. Sometimes they don't, and the lesson is about being your own best company. But no matter what, you deserve a love that makes you feel like a favorite song played on a porch at dusk. Familiar in the best way, soothing without being dull, honest without being brutal, and kind all the way through. I see Leo in the hall now and then. Even though we've spent the morning at the same table, he'll be leaving for work. Kazoo probably in his bag for the emergencies life keeps inventing in second grade. And he'll turn that little crinkle in his eye and say, "See you next door," like it's both blessing and fact. I'll wave with the same hand I once used to hold a cup of tea steady during a difficult conversation and think, what a ridiculous, improbable, tender life we get to live. We didn't write this story alone. The building wrote it with us. The flickering light, the stubborn mailbox, the echo of footsteps at 7 in the morning that always sounded like someone late for a bus they didn't really need to catch. Mrs. Green and her potato salad wrote it with their steady kindness. The awful silence wrote the first lines, and the candled storm wrote the middle. We'll keep writing the rest in little, ordinary sentences. I'll keep a paintbrush around, not because I expect to keep repainting, but because I trust us to touch up as we go. If you're listening alone in your kitchen tonight, No, that is a beautiful place to be. If you're listening with someone you love, thank them for being enthusiastic about your soup even when it's too salty. If you once were ghosted and now have a neighbor who is a stranger who smiles in the hall, offer them a hello that doesn't cost you more than you want to spend. I'll leave you with what my Aunt Ruth told me on my birthday last year. Right before she pressed a ribbon into my hand because she likes to put history into people's pockets, she said, "May your doors be honest and your knocks be kind." I think about it every time I slide my key into my lock and hear the familiar click. Every time I hear his voice through the wall singing a verse into the evening air. Every time I see the little ceramic door holding court by the keys. We are here. We are learning. And sometimes, when the world is feeling generous and stubborn and playful all at once, the person who once stepped back quietly will step forward and say simply, "I'm sorry. May I come in?" And sometimes, miracle of modest miracles, you will answer in a warm, steady voice you recognize as your own. Yes, next door is a very good place to start.